Yes, this is another piece, a relief, but yearning and striving in its stone-like quality for three-dimensionality. This is by a great sculptor, Caius Gabriel Cibber, or Cibber, a Dane, who did an enormous amount of work during this sort of Baroque, Augustan and allegorical period. This is a truly sort of 18th century version of a classical conceit as they attempt to realise it. Charles II pleads on behalf of art and science and the muses to restore a damaged London which has been ravaged by fire and destruction. It's a sort of heroic post-Renaissance painting in stone. Everyone's highly idealised, everyone's upward looking, everyone's made to look as noble as possible. And Cibber in turn was an extraordinary sculptor who's quite famous now for influencing some modernist sculptors, because two of his most famous pieces are the grotesque and gibbering figures outside what used to be a Bedlam hospital in South London. One's called Madness and the other's called Raving Melancholy. And they're interesting grotesques that partly relate to medieval art and now are still there outside the entrance to the Imperial War Museum. We have a relief, again very solid in its 2 to 3 dimensionality, from St Paul's Cathedral. It shows a biblical scene, the conversion of St Paul, or Saul, who sees the divine light on the road to Damascus, is thrown from his horse, and the persecutor of the Christians becomes the founder of Christ's Church. And yet in a strange way, for to my mind, the Baroque or post-Baroque and sort of highly individualised sensibility of the piece doesn't have that much to do with Christianity. It's a typically post-Renaissance work whereby Christian discourse and narrative heritage is used as the model on which you do a modern version of a classical sculpture. So we've got the horsemen rearing up, being thrown from their mounts, the divine sun coming down from the clouds, and all of these Israelites, as it were, are depicted like warriors from the ancient world who are mysteriously wearing armour and carry weapons that are from the beginning of the 18th century. This dates from 1706 and is by Francis Bird, who's a very famous sculptor of the period, did an enormous amount of work in and around St Paul's. Probably the modern sensibility would find his version of the Duke of Newcastle in that cathedral to be the most interesting of his works. This is a savage and rather grotesque piece in the form of a large sculptural tomb in which two skeletons tear apart the bottom end of an oak tree. Here we move forward a little bit in time, but the vogue and the sensibility is still very much the same. This, believe it or not, is a bust of the then Princess and later Queen Victoria. It's from the collection at Windsor Castle and dates from 1829 by William Behnes. And you notice the young Victoria is depicted much like the present Queen's painting by Annigoni, as a sort of exultant and superbly modelled being, and she looks like the young daughter of a Roman senator. But this is very much the way in which the English and British nobility wished to be perceived at that time. A certain sort of yearning and sort of expectant and transcendent quality. These busts were done for almost anyone of renown at the time, and they would have been done in her case to royal commission and for such patronage. Although we've leapt from the beginning of the 1700s to the early section of the century that follows, you notice that this type of work is all of a piece, and there is a contiguous nature to British and English sculpture between the Restoration in 1660 and, say, the Great Reform Bill in 1867. You can virtually say the sensibility that masters the sculpture of this period, straddling over a century and a half, is the same sensibility. It's pre-romantic, it's Augustan, it's highly classical, and it's of a light stylised, early Michelangelo-driven interpretation of what the sculpture of the ancient world would have been like. There are many, of course, falsities and discontinuities because ancient sculpture was highly decorative and painted. We see it without paint because all the paint's rotted off. We see it as stone and white stone, or on occasion marble. But in actual fact, when these images are recreated, as they have been in the 20th century by imagisation techniques, particularly pioneered by the Victoria and Albert Museum, we get a totally different idea of what ancient sculpture was. So this is our idea of unpainted ancient sculpture thousands of years on, in order to celebrate the then imperial British aristocracy. Here we have another piece of stylised and slightly Baroque classicism, although more stereotypically classical in its way. It's of an aristocrat, the Countess of Bath, and it's by Balthazar Berman. Again, it's this attempt to heroicise through the revisualisation of the ancient world the aristocracy from the 17th, the 18th, and eventually the first half of the 19th century. So you have this sensibility which you will see in churchyards and vicarages and churches in particular up and down the country, whereby the nobility identifies themselves with the Christian tradition, with the classical tradition, with the Greco-Roman and Hellenistic tradition, and wants to celebrate through patronage their power and solidity in stone. I have another piece that relates to the style that I've just described. It again is of a provincial aristocrat, or at the very least august figure, Sir John Thornycroft. Whether he relates to Tory politicians with that name in the 20th century, I've got no idea. This is by Andreas Carpentier, and if you notice the way in which this individual wants to be depicted, he looks as though he's a drunk associate of a poet like Catullus in ancient Rome. He's lying on a bed or on the floor of a party making an allegedly witty remark, wearing a toga and an 18th century wig. So you see that people in vogue in their century wanted to be depicted as the heroes of the ancient world, particularly in literature and in the arts. So it's partly a fantasy that these people had about themselves, but it's also part of the power of the West. In the middle of the 20th century, a rather dissident American figure called Lawrence R. Brown, who was an engineer, wrote a book called The Might of the West. And these people believed totally in the Western civilization. They believed in its domination, they believed in its civilizing mission, they believed it extended through various incarnations from the ancient world. These were people who had no doubts, even about themselves, their society, its extension imperially across the earth, and the power of their own nationalities. They also saw themselves, Christian or otherwise, as the inheritors of the classical tradition. Full stop. In Augustan vogue, it's Lady Frederica Stanhope from Scheveningen in Kent, 1825. Slightly daring here because she's actually feeding her young child lying on the side in repose, although of course the sculpture is in many ways is a tomb and is meant to imply death. But maternal expressions of any sentiments involving female sexuality would be permitted in this period. Don't forget, we are slightly before what could be called what will become the High Victorian period. We have unnecessarily restrictive views about this time. We think this period was incredibly prudish and so on, when if you look at its three-dimensional art, you wouldn't actually draw that conclusion. The reason for this is the classicising and Hellenistic tendencies, which are so pronounced, so naked, almost literally so in this case. This sculpture is by Sir Francis Chantry, and it again is part of this idealising tendency in the aristocracy of the day to see themselves as the British equivalents of the leaders of the Roman Empire. Here we have a bust, a sculpture from the same era. It's in Burlington House, which is in Piccadilly, right in the centre of London, and which is today the centre of the Royal Academy. Although technically private, you could regard the Academy as the leading state art institution, the National Gallery accepted, in Britain. The piece is of George III, dates from the 1770s, and is by an Italian artist and sculptor, Augustino Carlini. You look at the sombre magnificence of this truculent German. He wants to be seen as a sort of Augustus, really, a sort of a modern Roman emperor, wearing a toga, of course, which people in his era didn't really wear, looking solemn, looking fierce, looking statesmanlike, if rather sober-minded and sort of lugubrious. No signs of the putative insanity which would have him leaving the coach in Windsor Great Park and engaging in excited conversation with the oak trees.